Only in America.
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 This week, we're picking up where we left off in the 1960s to understand the journey to comprehensive immigration reform 2 decades later.
If it definitely isn't ready if nobody steps up and seeks it. But, this is true of everything. If you go back and read the histories of the major civil rights bills, of the major environmental bills, there are these moments where it looks like there's impasse, that nothing's possible, and that key actors and key forces and key institutions often break with conventional wisdom to forge compromises that produce legislation. And it's really a question more of leadership and courage of, do we have the right people willing to step up at the right time, with the right ideas? Only time will tell.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani, and this is Only in America. Last week, we took a deep dive into the political climates that led to 2 landmark immigration laws. One codified racist quotas in the 1920s, and one expanded family-based immigration in the 1960s. So, what happened after 1965? As we learned last week, immigration policy is about much more than just deciding who's to be let in. It's about making a statement about who we are as a nation, what we value, and who we see as American. It's also a reflection of the politics of the moment, economic anxieties, cultural attitudes, and the attitudes of individual lawmakers who can make or break a comprehensive immigration proposal. Clearly, a lot of stars have to align for immigration reform to become law. So what happens when we reach an impasse?
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
The word refugee is thrown around a lot, but who does it actually refer to? We want to tell you about a new podcast from Virginia Public Media called Resettled. Resettled shares the intimate moments of refugees' lives and explores the policies that shape their future in the United States. From navigating the healthcare system to budgeting for a family with no credit history, hear from resettled refugees not as victims or statistics, but from their experiences firsthand. Listen and subscribe to Resettled wherever you get your podcasts.
Following the Immigration and Nationality Act, the next major immigration reform came during the Reagan era of the 1980s, and Charles Kamasaki was a first-hand witness. Working for UnidosUS, then known as the National Council La Raza, or NCLR, Charles became deeply involved in the delicate balancing act of shaping an immigration compromise. He's now a senior cabinet advisor for UnidosUS and author of the new book, Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die. Charles saw the challenges of finding an immigration approach that would be acceptable across the left and the right, from business advocates to labor organizers. As with the earlier debates of the 20th century, countless forces pushed and pulled the debate in all directions, making meaningful reform a tall order. Yet, in 1986, these forces came together to do just that with the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which provided legal status to millions of undocumented immigrants. It also made it illegal to knowingly hire undocumented workers. However, the path to compromise was by no means a short or straightforward one. Charles and I spoke about the hurdles we must overcome to create solutions, the politics of compromise, and how we can bring future reforms across the finish line.
There wasn't a big pro-immigrant push for reform at the time. The major policy thrust, I would say, from the maybe mid-60s leading up to the debate on the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which began in 82, was very much a push for enforcement. And so the thrust of the pro-immigrant advocates was generally to oppose this enforcement-oriented legislation. And so among the key players that kind of emerged through this process, Vilma Martinez and later Antonia Hernandez from the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund, MALDEF, I would characterize as kind of the hardline opposition. Raul Izaguirre, my former boss at the National Council of La Raza, was, I would think it's fair to say, kind of center-left, looking for opportunities to try and achieve legalization for undocumented people in the U.S. And the League of United Latin American Citizens, which, as I described, went from this kind of center-right organization much more towards a center-left position. And its leaders were a guy named Ruben Bonilla, who was the president of LULAC, and the executive director was Arnoldo Torres, who was really the chief lobbyist for the organization.
So what happened in 82 where, the conversation or the debate started to shift from an enforcement-centric approach around legislation to, actually beginning to try to think about and advance efforts for legalization?
Well, if I may, Ali, I'd like to start a little bit before then. So there were a convergence of events in the 60s and the 70s that led to really the creation almost of a quote-unquote problem of illegal immigration. One of those was the end of the Bracero program, which was an largely agricultural temporary worker program that allowed as many as 800,000 legal temporary workers to enter the U.S., mainly to do agricultural work. That program ended in 1964. But as I describe in the book, although the program ended, the practice of hiring immigrant labor to work the fields did not end. And so that turned into one stream of unauthorized workers. Second, the previous several decades had witnessed massive repatriations of Mexicans. That's repatriations in air quotes, including many American citizens, some of whom sought to enter and some of whom sought to bring their relatives with them. So there was migration, although some of it was unauthorized and some of it was lawful, of returning American citizens. Third, the 1965 Act actually began a process that eventually cut in half legal visas for Mexico. And then finally, all of this was converging at a time of the biggest growth in the Mexican fertility rate, the inability of that economy to absorb all the new workers entering. And so this perfect storm of factors, as it were, began a very high level of unauthorized migration in the late 60s up into the 70s. Peter Rodino, who later became chair of the Judiciary Committee in the House, then offered, with Ted Kennedy, a series of enforcement bills to address unauthorized migration. Those bills did not pass, mainly due to opposition from the agricultural lobby. So in the late 70s, an entity called the Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy was formed, led by some of the most important personages in the country, Father Ted Hesburgh, the president of Notre Dame. And it recommended what I would call really the first set of comprehensive immigration reforms, including tougher border enforcement, employer sanctions, making it unlawful to knowingly hire an unauthorized worker. It didn't mean to, but its recommendations also would have led to significant cuts in legal immigration, significant restrictions on asylum, and a very modest legalization program. So that was the bill ultimately that was introduced in 1982.
The two issues that seem to kind of come up over and over again over the course of the legislative debate are employer sanctions and temporary workers. Could you unpack kind of how those played out over this period of time? But then, I was struck also, and maybe I missed it, is that it did not seem like there was a level of antagonism towards the idea of legalizing undocumented to the level that we feel now.
Yeah, so those are the three big linchpins, right, of comprehensive immigration reform. So let's unpack them. Employer sanctions, the idea of making it unlawful for employers to knowingly hire undocumented workers, is an idea that was around for a long time, was actually began being debated on the 1952 Walter McCarran Act. And, its premise was very simple, right? That there was a quote unquote magnet of employment that drew unauthorized workers here. If we just demagnetize the magnet, those workers would automatically go away. Latino organizations and others, the ACLU, civil libertarians, opposed employer sanctions because we thought it would cause employment discrimination against people lawfully here. We also thought it was not going to be effective, that it would be too easy to evade. And I think the evidence suggests we were right on both counts. Its main proponents were organized labor. And, again, one of these interesting situations where about the evolution of positions and ideologies over time. The issue of temporary workers then and now remains an important part of the debate. And as I described earlier, growers of certain kinds of crops in the United States going way back to the days of the Bracero program, which, by the way, began as an emergency program during World War II, established a market whereby, it was just assumed that the vast majority of those workers working the fields would be immigrant workers, initially lawfully under the Bracero program and later as unauthorized workers. And, again, these issues still resonate today. What should we be doing with those workers? And if they're allowed to enter lawfully under a temporary worker program, to what extent they would be subject to exploitation, as many were in the Bracero era. And I think generally pro-immigrant advocates arguing that they ought to be, if we need the workers, then they ought to have lawful status. Legalization was always a controversial issue, and I think the public opinion polls generally suggested, 60-40, 2/3 to 1/3 opposition to legalization pretty consistently over the course of the debate. It was somewhat less controversial than it is today, in part because there was not the strict partisan divide. But I think it was also in an era where compromise was more acceptable or viewed as more acceptable. And the notion was that comprehensive immigration reform was, in theory, had something for everybody. It had something for restrictionists like organized labor in terms of tougher enforcement. It offered legalization to Latinos and progressives. And ultimately, there was a compromise on the temporary worker program to satisfy both business and labor. And so that was kind of the theory of this balanced, comprehensive package.
So as the bill went through the process, between, let's just say, 82, 86, I know things were happening before, where the ideas went through the legislative process, what finally got things past the finish line?
Well, I would say two things. I think it's useful to understand why it didn't pass immediately. And I describe in the book that this was a bill that was widely heralded. It had something like 300 editorials back when editorial boards made a difference, were published around the time the bill was introduced, fawning press coverage that it was clearly the solution to the problem of immigration, quote unquote. And it didn't pass in large part, I believe, because of very significant opposition, and really in ways that often went beyond the pale of what was normally considered acceptable nonprofit or public interest lobbying. So advocates from LULAC, NCLR, MALDEF, the ACLU, AILA, and the American Immigration Lawyers Association, which was then a new organization, and others did everything in our power to try and stop the bill because we thought there was something better to be had. So it died in 82 via a filibuster by amendment. It died in 1984 in conference committee after a first ballot boycott of Latino delegates pledged to Walter Mondale and other shenanigans. And ultimately, I think what broke through in the end, in the last Congress when it was considered in 1985 and 1986, were two factors. One was the emergence of a pro-compromise wing or faction of the Hispanic caucus very much supported by most of the advocacy groups, where I think it was felt that we had been successful in defeating bad bills, but along the way had been relatively successful in making the bill more acceptable, and that now was the time to seek compromise. So I think that was an important factor. And then there was a deal around the agricultural worker issue where essentially growers were given what they thought at the time was essentially an unlimited supply of workers. And in return, organized labor and Latino advocates got legalization for those workers, the so-called special agricultural worker program. So I think most analysts, and I would agree, think that those were the two major factors: a willingness to compromise by Latino and other pro-immigrant organizations, and this special agricultural worker program, which kind of broke the Gordian knot, which was the final barrier to achieving reform.
And what I really appreciated about the work here, the book here, is that it's not just the picture of kind of what's happening on the Hill and all the different maneuvers, whether it's the members or the advocates utilize, but then also kind of how the coalition of organizations changed and morphed over time and grew. As the effort got closer to 84, 86, were there organizations that emerged that you just saw, looking back, as kind of big net pluses on the effort?
Well, Ali, the organization you had, the National Immigration Forum, was critical to this entire debate. You know, very different organization at the time, but really was the umbrella for the pro-immigrant forces, not just in DC, but nationally, including, you know, these emerging little networks that finally became major immigrant coalitions that played a huge role in implementing the program. And then, even though it's just kind of a cameo in the book, we were very much in touch the whole period with organizers, maybe the precursors to the very rich field of pro-immigrant community organizers that exist today. And I do write about Bert Corona, who headed the most important of them, the Hermandad Mexicana Nacional, and the role that they played in not just lobbying on behalf of the bill, but also in keeping those of us in Washington accountable, because we knew they were watching what we were doing.
Are there parallels that you see, when you read the news or you're doing the work on a day-to-day basis today versus, what you went through and experienced back then? Are there parallels or differences that we should be keeping in mind?
Well, I think the differences, right, are fairly obvious, and I think are often raised as suggesting why the history might not be as relevant today, right? It is more partisan. People say the racial issues are more public now, but I think their memories aren't so good. The Congress operates very differently now than it did previously. So I would readily acknowledge lots of differences. What strikes me is the similarities. Race was a huge part of the debate back then, and it's a huge part of the debate today. And, I laugh when people say, race relations and racial tensions are so much greater now than they were before. And they might be more public in some ways. But, back in the 70s and 80s, we were at the beginning of this massive demographic change. We had the entry of 1.5 million Southeast Asian refugees, and that was hugely controversial. And, race was very much a part of public debates. And so I think there are more similarities than there are differences with respect to the kinds of atmosphere. I do think for today's debate, I think a couple of things are true. One, as occurred in the past, I think the breakthroughs will come from folks willing to buck the conventional wisdom, right? So we have a conventional wisdom that says at some level nothing is possible. And I think things are possible. I think reform is possible, but actors have to have the willingness and the courage to break with conventional wisdom. I would say the one major difference this time versus last time, as I described, last time around, the proponents of legislation were seeking restriction. It was very much an enforcement-focused bill that I think advocates were able to shape into a more balanced bill, and its proponents were willing to compromise. This time around, it's the pro-immigrant forces that are seeking change. We bear the burden of trying to overturn the existing order. And therefore, we're going to have to bear the burden of compromise if we want to actually see something done.
And do you think the movement in its current iteration is ready for that?
Here's what I think. If it definitely isn't ready if nobody steps up and seeks it. But, this is true of everything. If you go back and read the histories of the major civil rights bills, of the major environmental bills, there are these moments where it looks like there's impasse, that nothing's possible, and that key actors and key forces and key institutions often break with conventional wisdom to forge compromises that produce legislation. So what I would say is the current very rich, very talented, and I might say very well resourced compared to decades previously, has everything it needs to be able to achieve positive reforms that are good for immigrants and good for the country. And it's really a question more of leadership and courage of, do we have the right people willing to step up at the right time, with the right ideas? Only time will tell, but I'm ever the optimist on this issue.
So after doing this massive project, doing all this research, talking to all these people, going back to that quote from NCLR, the statement from NCLR in 86 after the bill passed, after knowing what you know now, do you still believe that IRCA was the best bill possible at the time?
Indeed, I do. And, I will admit to major misgivings. We as an institution, and I personally, were attacked pretty significantly from our left. At the time we made that call, there were people running around Capitol Hill using the sellout word prominently. We didn't have an internet then, thank God. There was no Twitter, but to the extent there were, whispering campaigns and such, we certainly took our share of that criticism. And I like to remind people, and the same was true, by the way, of the 1990 Act, which was also very progressive, even though it didn't start that way. Because I think the issue, was IRCA and 1990 Act, were they the best possible bills compared to whatever we could dream up in our mind? The answer is no. Obviously, they're deeply flawed bills, reflecting the inevitable compromises that occur in the legislative process. But I think compared to what likely would have happened, right, it's all speculation, but, it was just in 1994, 4 years after the 1990 Act, that California passed ballot Proposition 187. In 1996, right, IRA and welfare reform passed, both extraordinarily restrictive with respect to legal as well as unauthorized immigrants. And, at least in my conscience and my mind is clear that we made the right call, that had we waited for another couple of cycles, I suspect things would have gotten worse, not better.
Speaking of California and 187, the role that Congressman Pete Wilson plays in IRCA and then goes on to play in California as governor is worth a book unto its own.
Yeah, indeed. So he was, almost the illustration, the definition of opportunist, very pro-immigrant when he was in D.C. And then he, ran on Proposition 187 for governor once he went back home.
Well, this is an amazing piece of work. Thank you for the time, Charles. And I have one last question for you. So the name of the podcast is Only in America. And I ask all of our guests the same question. And that is just a request to finish this sentence. Only in America, ...
Well, only in America can a Japanese American end up working for a Latino civil rights organization and with no background at all, end up 30 some odd years later writing a book about immigration reform.
Charles Kamasaki is a senior cabinet advisor for UnidosUS and author of Immigration Reform, The Corpse That Will Not Die. You can find more information about Charles on our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And next week, tune in as we continue to take a look at the history of legal immigration and what it means for our future. If you like what you hear, subscribe to Only in America on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor, Megan Wetmore, and Becca Wall. Our artwork and graphics are designed by Carla Leha. I'm Ali Nirani, and I will talk to you next week.